Bonjour, bienvenue. Merci beaucoup de nous avoir rejoints aujourd'hui. Today's lecture is going to be chaired by my colleague John de Boer. John has done an extraordinary job of reimagining our programming in the area of governance and justice in his time here, working with a number of valued colleagues who were here before his arrival, and James's subject matter falls squarely in John's area. James Cockayne is a very unusual scholar and policy actor. He's been living in New York now for a number of years, operating at the intersection of the academic world, the policy world, and to a degree also the activist world on his issues. For one so young, he's had an extraordinary number of jobs already. He was the principal legal officer in the International Crime Unit of the Australian Attorney General's office before moving to New York. He worked as a senior fellow at the International Peace Institute. And until very recently, he was co-director of the Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation, leading their work in Africa and on the UN, with much of his own focus being on the Horn of Africa. He's been a constant in the policy debates surrounding security at the UN. The international community has been primarily mobilized, I'd say, in the area of crime by the fight against terrorism over the last 12 years. And a number of other issues didn't quite fall off the table, but were not getting the attention they received. And James, I think, has worked hard and very effectively to correct that. But in any event, you'll be the judges of that because he's now going to take over the podium. Merci donc beaucoup de nous.
So, thank you very much for coming.
Propos de Monsieur Cockayne en français, il y a une traduction simultanée avec des écouteurs disponibles.
Simultaneous translation is available.
Là-dessus?
No.
No. Okay.
And as well for the question period, which will follow Mr. Cockayne's talk, please, you can ask your questions in French, and the interpreters will be translating.
Veux-tu aller le dire? Vas-y.
David, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, we've become accustomed to the idea that over the past 20 years, international interventions, from peacekeeping to development, have begun to control global violence, in particular civil war. According to the World Bank's 2011 World Development Report, the annual number of battle deaths from civil wars fell from roughly 160,000 per year in the mid-1980s to something under 50,000 per year in the last decade. But what if this success story is not all that it's cracked up to be? What if violence has not ceased, but rather morphed? What if the classical political violence of interstate and civil war is now simply being replaced by the messier criminal violence of warlords, gang leaders, drug barons, and mafias? 14 countries now have a criminal homicide rate above 30 per 100,000, putting them in a range similar to many civil wars. Frequently, those high death rates coincide with the presence of organized crime. At least 2 countries, El Salvador and Honduras, have criminal death rates that are roughly 50% higher than the current death rate in Syria. In other words, criminal violence risks becoming as much of a threat to human security as is conflict. So how should we deal with this violence? We even struggle, frankly, with naming it. We aren't sure whether to think of gang leaders and drug lords as conflict actors and potential participants in peace processes, or as criminals and targets for law enforcement. The distinction is far from merely semantic. Take discussions over NATO's Afghanistan exit strategy. Whether we consider the Taliban and its allies, such as the Haqqani network, to be political belligerents or organized criminals has very real and immediate impacts. If they're political actors, then perhaps they can become partners for peace. If they're criminals, then surely they must be targets for law enforcement. If they're political actors, then it's entirely legitimate, isn't it, for humanitarian actors and mediation NGOs to engage with them. If they're criminals, perhaps not. So our policy responses and even the tools made available to analyze and interact with these groups very quickly become path-dependent. What, though, if this dichotomy is simply wrong? Today, I want to explore a very simple hypothesis. I want to explore the idea that organized criminals perhaps are not simply pursuing profit, as we so often assume, but actually power. A particular kind of power, to be sure, one that forgoes formal political authority, a kind of power that works from behind the throne rather than seeking to occupy it, a kind of power that governs in and from the shadows, but political power nonetheless. Power intended to control the state's normative and enforcement capacities, power that fundamentally alters the dynamics of conflict and the trajectory of state development. Ladies and gentlemen, my lecture today aims to explore the challenges that we face in confronting this kind of criminal power, the challenges of shadowboxing. I'm going to do that by answering three questions. First, does it actually make sense to think of criminal organizations as pursuing power rather than profit? Second, if they are so driven, where does violence fit in? What is the role of violence in the pursuit of criminal power? And third, so what? What does that all mean for our responses to conflict, our approaches to post-conflict recovery, and for development? Let's turn to the first question. Does it make sense to say that criminal organizations pursue power rather than profit? A decade ago, the World Bank and Oxford economist Paul Collier promoted almost the inverse idea. He suggested not that some organized crime groups are political, as I'm going to discuss today, but rather that all civil war can be understood as organized crime. Rebels, he argued, turn out to be greedy economic opportunists. The subsequent debate over greed and grievance, led by Idrc President David Malone, amongst others, has helped to unpack the relationship between the methods and motives of civil war actors. But what about the methods and motives of organized criminal actors? When are they merely criminal, and when are they properly thought of as political? The traditional view is neatly summarized by a phrase in a recent US Army counterinsurgency strategy, which suggests that we shouldn't think of criminal groups as political actors because, quote unquote, their goal is profit, not power. Well, that's what the experts say. But what about the criminals themselves? What do they think of this issue? Roberto Scarpinato, an expert on the Italian mafia, recounts a conversation he had with a mafioso, Marino Manoia, who had turned state's witness. Quote, "The actual goal is power. The sinister passion of the capo is not the hunger for money, but the hunger for power. Marino Manoia once said to me, "It's often believed that people work with the Cosa Nostra for money, but that's only partly true." Do you know why I became a uomo d'onore? Because before I had been a nobody in Palermo, and then afterwards, where I went, heads bowed. You can't value that in money, unquote. Giovanni Falcone, the Italian anti-mafia judicial magistrate who was assassinated by the Cosa Nostra in 1992, called this the mafia's quote-unquote logic of power. And it's not peculiar to Italy. Adam Elkis, for example, an expert on Mexican cartels, likewise describes their goal as power over people. What's more, the competitions that criminal groups wage for this power feel and look like wars, the quintessential competition for political power. The cartel war in Mexico has killed over 50,000 people in the last 5 years. One of the main protagonists, Los Zetas, grew out of the Mexican military special forces. Military-style weapons, including armored vehicles, submarines, even encrypted electronic communications are commonplace. Similarly, drug trafficking organizations from Colombia to Afghanistan to Burma and now to Mali have all developed military capabilities that they use against states. So too trafficking organizations in other parts of Africa and in southeastern Europe. So these look and feel like wars, competitions for political power. But is that actually what these groups are seeking? The power to control a normative order, which is the way that Max Weber defined political power a century ago. Yes. In the underworld, organized crime wields governing power. Let me explain. Illegal businesses face a host of challenges that legal firms do not. There are no courts, no police that you can turn to in criminal markets. So possession isn't 9/10 of the law, possession is the law, pure and simple. There's no recourse other than violence when you receive poor quality goods and services. There's limited information about who you're dealing with in the market, your counterparties. All of that risk makes for high capital investment and borrowing costs, short business planning horizons, and limited opportunities to dispose of your assets, to realize your profits. So what happens? Powerful criminal firms start filling these gaps. For a fee or a cut, they will resolve disputes. They will provide counterparty guarantees and insurance, they'll set norms, they'll allocate resources, and they'll even provide you protection against some foreign ruler, like the state, interfering in the market. It's in this sense that Donald Cressy 50 years ago told the United States Congress that organized crime is, quote-unquote, both business and government. Organized crime groups can assemble armies, sure, but what is really revealing is that they can also take on legislative and judicial functions within limited territories, markets, or populations. Even as they take on these governing roles, though, what separates organized crime from civil war actors is precisely that organized crime does not seek to replace the state, as do traditional insurgent and rebel groups. Organized crime rules the underworld from the shadows. But for there to be an underworld, there has to be an upperworld. There are no shadows without a state to cast those shadows. As Hermann Schwartz explained it, quote, "It is the state's decision to code activities as licit or illicit, its decision to provide or deny enforcement, that brings mafias into being. Eliminate or supplant the state, and you remove the criminal tariff, you eliminate criminal rents, and you lose the basis for the governing power of criminal organization. Criminal power is a unique, informal kind of political power that requires leaving the state in place, at least formally. As we shall see, it may well seek to influence the way the state uses its authority. It certainly seeks to exclude the state from effective control of the underworld. But for the organized crime, some kind of state is a necessity. And that is what has led us to the mistaken conclusion that because organized crime doesn't seek to replace the state, it cannot be seeking political power. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to re-examine that belief. So now we come to our second question. If it's true that some criminal organizations do wield political power, then how do they achieve this power in the first place? And in particular, where does violence fit in? In two places. First, as a tool of internal organization, and second, as a method of external positioning against rivals. Let's begin just briefly with the question of internal organization. If we think of some organized crime groups as wielding governing power, then it follows that they must construct this power within, in fact, out of, the gaps in state governance capacity. Weak state enforcement power means low risks for crime, and thus low costs for producing and distributing criminal goods and services. It also means larger opportunities to govern criminal markets and harvest criminal rents. Once we realize this, the convergence between conflict and crime begins to make a whole lot more sense. By weakening the state without completely eliminating it, conflict facilitates criminal organization and its development of governing power. It simply makes it cheaper. It makes it easier. Let's take some examples. In Guatemala, civil war destroyed key infrastructure, reduced state finances, and weakened and delegitimized state enforcement agencies. The workforce acquired advanced expertise in violence, low risk aversion, and had few prospects in the legitimate economy. The result? Local criminal networks have flourished, and foreign traffickers like Mexico's Zetas have built cross-border supply chains through Guatemala. Take another example, West Africa. Decades of war and structural adjustment have left state officials in West Africa, particularly in the military, confronted with low incomes, superiors and subordinates demanding patronage, and weak protection from state law enforcement agencies. The result? Mali. Security officials and political elites are easy pickings for foreign trafficking organizations seeking political protection and logistical capacity. State military capacity nosedives, and non-state armed actors becoming an increasing threat to territorial integrity. Or take the Balkans. There, violence became normalized through years of conflict. Discourses of nationalism provided cover for criminal activity. The refugee diaspora provided ready-made sinews for criminal entrepreneurs. And privatization programs afforded opportunities to launder the spoils of war. The result? The transformation of wartime militias and criminal groups into political machines. One ruling party is even reliably alleged to have been involved in organ trafficking. In other words, conflict reduces the costs of crime. In particular, it reduces the costs of what I'm going to call the 4 Cs, the 3 capabilities organized crime needs to be successful: coercion, corruption, and communications. And it reduced the costs of control, the 4th C. Take coercion. Coercive capacity is central for organized crime. It's used to enforce discipline, to enforce contracts, to attack rivals, and for primitive capital accumulation, looting. Conflict makes coercion cheaper. Coercive expertise and weapons become more readily available. Or take corruption. Criminal groups use corruption to buy political protection and control how states make and enforce norms. Conflict makes that easier because insecure livelihoods and state salaries means that the price of corruption drops. Or third, take communications. Like legitimate business, organized crime only persists if it can maintain a social license to operate. Exactly how broad that license must be depends on the nature of its business, in particular, its reliance on local labour. Drug production is labour intensive. You need a broad social license to grow drug crops. Drug trafficking, less so. Either way, conflict makes it easier to win that license by appealing to hardened in-group, out-group values. Criminal groups quickly become chief protection providers and can piggyback on community protection discourses. As a result, from Bosnia to Iraq, we've seen ethnic cleansing campaigns serve as a cover for criminal groups to loot and pillage and gain control of trafficking routes. And finally, there's the capacity you need to manage all of these capabilities, control. Managing these capabilities can be very difficult for criminal organisations. Criminal agents are surrounded by temptations to cheat their bosses. And monitoring your workers is inherently difficult given the clandestine nature of the business. You can't rely on the courts to enforce employment contracts. So many criminal organisations deal with these managerial capability challenges by forging a strong corporate culture. A shared criminal culture provides a common operating system and a strong psychological brake on the temptations to cheat and defect. Criminal groups all over the world develop sophisticated criminal codes, such as the Mafia's Omerta. Rites of passage from the outside of the group to the in-group are common. And the existential transformation of this individual criminal identity is quite frequently written, literally written directly onto the body of the individual undergoing that transformation. Hence the tattoo culture we see in the underworld, in Russian mafias, the Japanese Yakuza, and the Central American Maras. Again, conflict makes all of this easier. War generates tightly knit social networks, many of them with ready-made military command and control structures. Post-conflict militias are thus particularly well positioned to move into organised crime. And that, in fact, is exactly the pattern we've seen in many places, such as Kosovo. At least while the state remains formally in place, conflict thus seems to offer criminals significant comparative cost advantages for building organisations to capture criminal rents. But that's only half the story, as I said. It tells us how criminal groups organise internally and where violence fits in. But it doesn't tell us what we should expect of those criminal groups, how they're going to position themselves in the environment against external actors. So I want to turn to that question now, external positioning. To me, this is central to our understanding of why, how, and when criminal groups use violence. My hypothesis is that at least some criminal groups use violence strategically. They make deliberate choices about how to use force to maximize their political power. And they do so not only in their dealings with business rivals, other criminal groups, but also in their dealings with states and other sources of political authority, like tribal leaders or religious institutions, or even international development actors or peacekeepers. In the next few minutes, I want to briefly sketch a typology of 5 different positioning strategies that I think we actually see criminal actors using in the real world to maximize their political power. These are the Warlord Strategy, the Mafia Strategy, Terrorism as a criminal strategy, the Blue Ocean Strategy, and Joint Venture Strategy. Each one has significant, and I'm going to suggest very different, implications for conflict exit and recovery and for development strategies. So let's begin with the Warlord Strategy. Contemporary conflict and state-building processes quite often generate territorial enclaves within states, which are ruled by military strongmen and insurgent groups. Often these enclaves are artifacts of geography. They're a result of the state having trouble penetrating a mountain range or operating in a jungle or confronting a desert. We see examples in Colombia, in Burma, in Afghanistan, and now in parts of the Sahel. The leaders that emerge within these enclaves often adopt what I would call a neo-feudal posture towards the state. They seek neither to replace it nor to secede from it, but rather to exercise a high degree of autonomy while remaining within the formal state political hierarchy. This is a strategy of de facto accommodation, often sustained through a combination of low-level hostilities with state forces and corruption of those same state forces. The aim here is not the aim of a traditional insurgent or civil war actor. It's not to displace the state. The aim is to leave it where it is and avoid the costs and responsibilities of formal political rule while maintaining sufficient military control over local markets to reap the rewards of governing those markets, in particular where there are criminal rents available. These are not the warlords of early modern Europe. They're not seeking to develop a reinforcing relationship between productive legal capital and armed coercion, as did early Europe's princes. Instead, today's warlords rely on extracting revenue from criminal markets operating within the territory that they control militarily. Opium in Afghanistan and Burma, coca in Colombia, hostages in the Sahel, piracy in Somalia, diamonds and rubber and timber in West Africa. Warlords are using force to govern criminal markets, the essence of criminal strategy. Understanding the centrality of the criminal economy to these warlords' political power is thus crucial to how we shape our conflict resolution and development efforts. Take the question of institutional capacity. The nature of the criminal rents that a warlord controls seem to dictate the scope of governance apparatus and the nature of that apparatus that the warlord builds. We're back to our social license question. If the criminal rents come from labour-intensive activities, for example involving agricultural production like coca or poppy farming, or from mineral resource extraction that requires a lot of labour, then the warlord needs a certain amount of popular participation, not necessarily legitimacy, but at least participation. In that case, some kind of limited service provision and governmental apparatus may emerge, though it's likely to be less differentiated, more personalised, more arbitrarily run, probably more authoritarian than we'd normally expect from liberal state governmental apparatus. That kind of apparatus might provide some sort of institutional base on which development activities could build, although a highly authoritarian and problematic one. But what about if the warlord isn't relying on that kind of labour-intensive local economy, and rather relying simply on taxation of criminal flows moving through his territory, as we see, for example, in some drug trafficking situations? Then the warlord has less incentive to build governance services and welfare apparatus to engage the population. That warlord's financial and political power comes not from the labour of the population, but simply from taxing a flow controlled by a very small number of people. So institutional capacity is more likely, as a result, to focus on control of the population and territory and less on service provision. Those kinds of warlords seem much less likely to be appropriate partners for development efforts. So understanding the basis of the criminal rents that a warlord masters is crucial to the development of our own engagement strategy. Let's move now to a second positioning option for criminal organizations, the Mafia Strategy. Instead of carving out an entire territory that they can rule relatively autonomously like a warlord, some criminal organizations embed themselves as a functional intermediary between the state and some segment of society, without exercising exclusive military control over a defined territory. This gives them a brokering power, which allows them to control criminal rents and thus give rise to criminal organisation. We call those criminal organisations mafias. Mafias are mediating powers. They control marginalised groups' access to the goods and services offered by higher political powers, while also serving as a gatekeeper for the state's access to local populations if it needs things from them, like votes. Mafias use violence to govern this interface between the upper world and the underworld, controlling criminal markets and extracting criminal rents. It's the classic pattern of organised crime that we see in places like Italy, Jamaica, and Haiti. It's also been a major factor in northern Mali in recent years. But perhaps more worryingly, it also seems to be a recurring feature of post-intervention settings, like Kosovo, Russia, and Central America. Why? Well, there are several aspects of contemporary international policy in post-conflict settings that, frighteningly, seem to be encouraging post-conflict armed groups to adopt a mafia strategy. First, there's the emphasis on elections. Politicians' need for votes pushes them into the arms of mafia strongmen who control populations that can deliver them those votes. Politicians' need for campaign finance pushes them towards the looters and pillagers of war who have ready cash. And all of those illicit actors, in turn, use political campaign finance to launder their ill-gotten gains and to perpetuate their power structures and to buy post-war influence. All of this suggests a radical need to rethink campaign finance controls in post-conflict settings. Second, there's the emphasis on localization in post-conflict recovery, as we've seen, for example, in Afghanistan and Somalia. There are very good reasons to push spending and enforcement power down to the local level after conflict ends. It helps generate democratic legitimacy, for one thing. And it may shield the central government from criminal corruption efforts. But it only does that by dispersing those efforts to the local level. It encourages criminal actors to target the people who actually control spending and enforcement, local authorities. And they're much more likely to be vulnerable than central institutions, not least because monitoring multiple local bodies is much more costly for international development partners. So the danger is that this policy actually has the unintended consequence of driving criminalization down to the local level and entrenching it at that level. That's certainly the pattern we've seen in federated states like the United States and Colombia, and it's arguably a pattern that's been present in the historical development of countries like Mexico and Italy. Third, there's the emphasis on market and trade liberalization in post-conflict economic policy. Both policies reward those with existing market power, ignoring the fact that it usually has grown out of the barrel of a gun. Asset privatization offers huge money laundering opportunities, as we've seen in Russia and Kosovo. Over-hasty market liberalization can simply lead to crony capitalism, and precipitate trade liberalization rewards those who can provide cross-border logistical capacity. Unsurprisingly, many of them have a past in trafficking. In other words, this policy of over-hasty liberalization rewards the people who've already developed power and can interface between local markets and foreign political authorities, or between local political authorities and foreign markets. In other words, it rewards mafias. So let's turn now to a third criminal strategy that we see out there in the real world. This is what I would call terrorism as a criminal strategy. It's a strategy of confrontation where warlord and mafia strategies are strategies of accommodation. Terrorism as a criminal strategy frequently involves an effort by a criminal group to defend itself against state pressure or intrusion, forcing a change in policy or practice. And there are numerous examples of this. The mid-1980s attacks on civilian airliners and judges and even the Supreme Court by the Medellin cartel, the Cosa Nostra attacks on the Uffizi Gallery and various judicial figures in the early 1990s, or more recently, the 2006 attacks in Brazil by the PCC. But terrorism as a criminal strategy can also take on a more offensive slant if the target is not the state, but the population itself. We can understand the decapitation tactics of Iraq's sectarian militias in these terms. They aimed at terrorizing and depopulating entire neighborhoods in order to allow the people who were doing the decapitation to control the smuggling routes that passed through those neighborhoods and the housing stock of the real estate itself. Likewise, the limb chopping tactics of the RUF in Sierra Leone, designed to control diamond mining areas. The danger of such a strategy, though, for a criminal organization, is that it sets off an arms race with other criminal groups, much as we now see in Mexico. Each group has to resort to more brutal tactics in order to terrorize the increasingly numb population into submission. Violence soars and development prospects sputter. Let's turn now to the fourth strategy, Blue Ocean Strategy. This is neither an accommodation nor a confrontation strategy. These groups decide to move, seeking new markets through geographic innovation or through technological innovation. The term is called Blue Ocean Strategy after a nice little story that some business consultants developed. The idea is that pirates operate in a crowded market, so crowded, in fact, that the ocean is running red with blood, red ocean. So some canny pirates decide to strike out and build an entirely new market, preying on previously untapped shipping lanes in a new market. New ocean, it's a blue ocean. It's not running red with blood. But shiver me timbers, what do you know? This is actually how Somali piracy has developed in the last 10 years. In Somalia and now in West Africa, armed entrepreneurs have combined existing technologies like the AK-47, the grappling hook, and the motor skiff in entirely new ways to build an entirely new industry, the piracy industry, preying on high-seas shipping and their even more valuable assets, sailors. We've seen other examples of blue ocean criminal strategy in Africa in recent years too. In the 1990s, when AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, was confronted by the Algerian security services, it looked south to the relatively ungoverned space of the Sahel. There, over subsequent decades, it has first embedded itself in the local trafficking economy and then used a blue ocean strategy to develop an entirely new industry, the hostage-taking industry, which is the source of much of its operating costs today. Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who's just claimed responsibility for the attack on the In Amenas gas facility, was a key proponent of this strategy. And it was the development of that financial base out of hostage-taking and ransom payment that gave him the power he wields today. His strategy was in turn boosted by the unexpected arrival of some other blue ocean criminal strategists, Latin American cocaine traffickers who had responded to interdiction efforts in Central America and the Caribbean by pioneering an entirely new route to market in Europe, taking their cocaine through the Sahel. AQIM makes part of its money these days from protecting exactly those cocaine trafficking routes. They also, incidentally, make part of their money from protecting cigarette smuggling routes, which is why Mokhtar Belmokhtar is known as Mr. Marlboro. The challenge that blue ocean strategies pose for international response are pretty profound. Once we realize that criminal actors can carve out whole new markets and that they're looking across continents to do so, we begin to recognize the challenge of developing effective, crime-proofed conflict recovery strategies in a globalized economy. As the 2011 World Development Report made clear, crime control efforts in one country can easily create a balloon effect, pushing criminal organisations across borders. So stepped up post-conflict crime control risks displacing crime not only to neighbouring states, but as it turns out, across oceans into entirely new continents. As Ivan Briscoe has noted, how else did Andean cocaine end up in the middle of the Sahel? But equally, it may be that poorly designed post-conflict strategy can actually facilitate crime through, for example, over-hasty economic liberalisation, as I was suggesting earlier. That suggests that it could attract crime from overseas. And some suggest this is part of what's been behind the rise in cocaine trafficking in parts of West Africa, that the operating environment there got easier as a result of market reforms over the last 20 years. Yet this is a possibility that few analysts involved in military planning or development planning currently allow for. And finally, there is a fifth positioning option, not standing apart from the state, not moving elsewhere, but seeking to merge with the state, turning national government into a joint venture between upper world and underworld actors. In this worrying situation, organised crime becomes the strategic framework for national government itself, both the internal organisation and management of the state's capabilities and its foreign policy. Recent examples include Liberia under Charles Taylor, Serbia under Milosevic, present-day Guinea-Bissau, and arguably parts of Afghanistan and Burma, possibly also Mauritania in the Sahel. There's a simple quid pro quo going on here. In the joint venture strategy, political actors use criminal finance and organisation as an instrument of statecraft. They get access to off-the-book revenues, to clandestine force projection capabilities, and to social networks beyond day-to-day politics. National political and military institutions are used to capture and sustain control of criminal rents, both from local protection arrangements and from transnational flows passing through the country's territory. On the other hand, criminal actors in turn use the state's assets as part of their criminal business models and operations. They get access to state immunities and passports, to national aircraft and shipping registries, to the state banking system, and even state-owned vessels for trafficking purposes, as we've seen recently in Guinea-Bissau. This gives them huge competitive advantages in their competition with other criminal organisations. It simply becomes cheaper to conduct their business. The attraction of the joint venture strategy for political actors in conflict-affected spaces is evident. It seems to offer a shortcut to both increased revenue and reduced violence. You can use, if you're a national government, you can use the promise of access to transnational illicit flows as a source of governing power, a way to buy off post-conflict spoilers, a criminalised peace dividend. That seems to be exactly how, for example, the Burmese army made peace with some opium trafficking militias in the northeast of its country in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's also how previous governments in Bamako have made peace with Tuareg secessionists. Yet, as the Burmese example suggests, that may reduce violence in the short term, but it spells long-term trouble. It not only rewards violence, creating moral hazard, it also removes incentives for state-making in the sense of the development of the state's political legitimacy through the provision of effective governance and service provision. The development of a broad, productive base and effective taxation may no longer be seen as the state's best path to financial resources and political security. Broad-based social protection systems, such as courts, accountable policing, or welfare systems, may no longer seem attractive to the state rulers. Instead, as Will Reno has explained, political actors' private uses of state prerogatives and assets come to create a framework of rule outside formal state institutions, a shadow of formal structures of rule based on informal ties. What's more, it may begin to appear rational for some rulers to leave entire sections of their territory or population under criminal or rebel control, ruled by warlords that they are superior to but that have relative local autonomy, or ruled by mafias. That's one way of understanding what's going on in Afghanistan at present, or even what's been going on recently in the Sahel. So, what? Where does this leave us? How do we use these insights into the strategies of criminal groups to improve our own strategic responses? What are the implications of all of this for conflict resolution, for post-conflict recovery, and for development? Quite simply, all of this suggests that if we're going to improve our ability to make peace with such organised criminals and to prevent them from hijacking post-conflict recovery and development processes, we need to invest much more in understanding them, their organisations and their strategies. We need to understand where they draw their power from and how they sustain it. There are numerous practical steps that we can take. In the few minutes left, I want to quickly outline 7. First, we should develop common analytical templates identifying different types of criminal actors, describing their motivations and methods. Second, we should start incorporating that kind of analysis of criminal strategy, into conflict mapping, military planning, and development planning. Third, we could invest in research into the impact of criminal economies on peace processes in the past. There are a range of interesting cases out there involving governments attempting to make peace with criminal groups. Burma, Colombia, the current effort in El Salvador, efforts in Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Jamaica, Italy. But there's no systematic comparison of how these different peace efforts have fared and why they have gone the way they have gone. Fourth, we need to be thinking about how organised crime changes the geography of peace building, peacemaking, and post-conflict recovery. Those efforts tend to be mounted at the national level. But criminal economies don't work that way. They're not confined to one country's borders. They combine highly localized arrangements with transnational market flows. We should be thinking now about how peace efforts are impacted by this very different economic geography. Should we be engaging transnational diasporas more? Or should we be engaging business actors more? Come back to that throwaway line I had before about the role of cigarette smuggling in Mali. Some commentators suggest that there's such a huge amount of cigarette smuggling in the Sahel because it's the result of a deliberate policy by cigarette manufacturers to circumvent state taxes and controls on importation into the Maghreb. What that means is that maybe cigarette manufacturers have influence over the financial base of the actors in northern Mali. By changing their policy, they could alter economic dynamics in the region and thus political and military dynamics. It may or may not be the case. It's just a hypothesis, but it suggests that we should be looking outside the traditional list of peace actors to think about how to change the political economies that these actors draw on to sustain conflict. Do we need to be building capacity to monitor and implement peace agreements at the local level, making deals with local stakeholders? We certainly know that criminal markets work in highly different ways in different locations. And even if we do build that kind of localized monitoring and enforcement capacity, how do we bring that together in national strategy frameworks? What kind of technical capabilities do you need to have a coherent national strategy with different implementation in different locations? Fifth, we need to think about what kinds of payoffs will actually bring organised criminals into peace settlements and encourage the development of productive economies rather than criminal ones. We need to think about whether we're ready normatively to offer these kinds of payoffs. Amnesties? Perhaps, but we should be looking at how they fared in places like Colombia and Nigeria. Did they actually remove actors from the criminal market, or did they simply create incentives for increased criminal activity? What about licensing? Could we offer criminal actors the opportunity to continue their business activities, but perhaps under state supervision or international supervision? Well, if we're talking about logging, no problem. If we're talking about drug trafficking, that seems a little bit more difficult to contemplate. But as we know, that seems to be the way that violence was actually reduced in some countries like Burma. What about alternative livelihoods? Can we offer organised crime actors an alternative to their life in organised crime? Well, if we're talking about foot soldiers, then yeah, maybe we can do that. But what if we're talking about the guys at the top that take the largest cut of the criminal revenues? Can we actually offer them something that's sufficiently attractive? Is that the way to replicate the state-making process of early modern Europe? Or is it simply a path to entrenching criminal influence into the political system? Sixth, we need to think about how we can enforce peace agreements that include criminal actors when they try to defect. What incentives and levers are available to stop defection? We need to look systematically at how to control criminal infiltration and corruption of security agencies in the post-conflict setting. Surprisingly, we're in relatively early days of comparative analysis on those issues. But I also suspect that there may be lessons from efforts to develop soft enforcement, not the hard enforcement of security apparatus, but the soft enforcement of community enforcement of anti-crime norms. Here I'm talking about looking at examples like efforts in the United States to control gang violence through community engagement, or from programs like those run by the NGO Viva Rio in Brazil's favelas. They all seem to suggest that we should rely less on hard policing and more on building up civil resistance to organised crime in the first place. We've seen that kind of civil resistance emerge from the bottom up in Sicily with the anti-pizzo campaign, boycotting businesses that succumb to mafia extortion. We've seen it work with bottom-up efforts at transparency in Hong Kong, cutting the link between politics and crime. But how do we replicate that elsewhere? These are bottom-up, grassroots efforts. What is the role for international actors to facilitate those kinds of bottom-up efforts? Can that be done? And if so, how? Do we need to tap into existing non-state authority structures, like religious groups, traditional chiefs, or women's groups? And what role is there for the media? And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we should be thinking about what barriers there are to engaging with organised crime groups, even if we want to. Some of these are very practical barriers. The information we need about how these groups work is dispersed across different government agencies. So we need to think about how it can be integrated for meaningful, joined-up government response. But some, and this may be even harder, some of these barriers are normative. By labelling groups as organised crime, as criminal in the first place, we make them targets for law enforcement rather than partners for peace. That makes it very hard for mediators and peace builders to engage with them. And in some cases, where criminal groups have been listed, it makes it nigh on criminal for mediators and peace-building NGOs to engage with them. Personally, I think that outlawing engagement with these groups is unlikely to help us learn what makes these groups tick, to understand how they develop their power, how they sustain it, and therefore how we can reduce that power. Ladies and gentlemen, until we recognise organised crime for what it is, a strategy for achieving and wielding a particular shadowy kind of political power, we have little chance of reducing that power, of winning our competition with organized crime. We will be condemned to box with shadows. And I am afraid to say that the consequences will not fall on us. They will fall on those who are governed by organized crime and subject to its violent rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. My name is John DeBoer of Idrc, as David mentioned earlier, and thanks for that very thought-provoking, yet quite, I guess, uneasy presentation. It is no doubt a topic that is extremely difficult to research, where there is a tremendous paucity of data as well, but increasingly being recognized as a critical component of our work globally, but also of influencing change on the ground. We have approximately 30 minutes for questioning. We have 2 microphones here. So I'd like to encourage people who have questions to make their way to the microphones. N'hésitez pas de poser votre question en français.
Hesitate to ask your question in French as well.
Et aussi capable de parler en français.
And James can also converse in French.
Ways, though, I'd just like to ask a few questions. I think that you provoked us very, I think, frankly, about the need for a fundamental rethink in the way we understand and approach organized crime and the linkages between organized crime and development, security, also diplomacy. And you talked about political settlements. You talked about peace agreements. And really, I think, brought out a fundamental point that we have for too long, perhaps, been focused in a peaceful transfer of power from one group to another, but not understood how we can actually transform those power sources. And again, central, according to your discussion here, is the role played by organized crime, the shadow power element. So I'd like to probe you on what you think are some of those essential conditions that will allow us to move along that continuum, to move from transferring power to one of transformation. And secondly, on a more personal note, recognizing that much more research is going to have to be undertaken in this area, just be curious about how you actually undertook this research. It's not risk-free. It is very difficult to go beyond anecdote. So take us into your world, take us into your trips to Somalia, and give us a glimpse of what that research meant on the ground.
I might take the second question first. It helps when you can walk in and say, "Hi, my name's Mr. Cockayne." You'd be amazed how that breaks the ice when you're trying to do research on organised crime. It is extremely difficult. Data in this area is hard to come by, and when you do come by it, you really don't know if you can trust it. So the bottom line is a lot of what is called triangulation, a lot of corroborating evidence, trying to figure out what the motives of the person giving you the information might be and understand what agendas they're pushing. You can't come up with very secure, you can't always come up with very secure analyses of particular incidents. So you're looking for general trends. It's amazing, though, also how willing people are in many of these places to talk about this activity, because of the point I've been making, that it's not necessarily seen as illegitimate. It is frequently a source of goods and services for the local community. So they may understand that it's illegal, but that may not mean that it's illegitimate. Legal authorities may engage in all sorts of conduct which makes them appear more illegitimate, for example, because they're shaking down the local population for bribes. So we need to understand that that legal and illegal does not map squarely onto legitimate and illegitimate. They often combine in very complicated ways, and that actually leaves some wiggle room for doing this kind of research. To come then on to your question about what are the essential conditions for transformation of power rather than transfer of power, which I think is an excellent way of putting it, John. That depends, of course, on the specific case, but the key, I think there are two key things to bear in mind. First, it's really hard. I think that is a lesson we have all been reminded of, if we didn't already know it, through watching the efforts of some countries, in particular the United States, to wield power to transform political structures around the world in the last decade in particular. Second, if you want to have any chance of success to transform power structures on a long-term sustainable basis, you need to combine carrots and sticks, and you need it to be embedded in local normative orders. What I mean by that in very practical terms is you need the support of society. So you have to figure out where there are sources of power within civil society that you can work with and align their incentive structures with the changes you're seeking to wreak. You need to back them up through credible enforcement capacity. And in many post-conflict settings, we don't offer credible enforcement capacity. We perhaps offer a short-term fix through an international military presence, but everybody at the local level knows that that's going to go away eventually. So for them, it's just a question of attrition and outlasting those actors. And when we have not learnt, I don't think, how to build quickly local, effective, legitimate police forces, despite our ongoing efforts to understand how to do that. And then you also need carrots, not just sticks, but carrots. You need to be able to scale up quickly all of the service provision that will offer a sufficient incentive for the community to want to ally with the state long term. And that's where we come back to more traditional development policy.
Thank you. So let's go to the audience now. Perhaps we can start at the left. We will be taking questions in batches. So please, identify yourself and then pose the question or the comment.
Yes, my name's Leon Surratt. I'm a retired English professor, so I don't know anything about any of this really. But one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to you is that the state depends for the rule of law and order on the monopoly of power, of violence, I should say, the monopoly of violence. And clearly that's broken down. It struck me as listening to you that during the Cold War, the West, or the United States, if you like, relied on strongmen who they favored, who monopolized power. It's not clear to me exactly why that strategy, which I don't approve of, but which worked for some considerable time, why it has broken down. And just as a supplement to that, I wonder if, in fact, the drug trade to which you referred repeatedly and other forms of illicit revenue are the key to that breakdown of the Cold War peace, if you want to call it that, of strongmen backed by the United States and Europe, NATO, I suppose.
Thank you. Thank you. I am Musa Mohammed, Ambassador of Sudan to Canada. Thanks to the distinguished lecturer on this insight he gave us on the organized crime, this interesting subject. And my observation is that there was a much focus on what I may call the modus operandi of these organized crime groups. And I agree with Mr. John that this issue is very complicated and it is very difficult and needs much research on this side of the goal, the modus operandi, the tactics, the strategies of these groups. But what I think is more important is what are the strategies and the mechanism in particular nationally and in particular internationally, because it is well known that the organized crime, they just pose a lot of and very seen dangers to the economies, to the people, to the lives of the people. And you know that, for instance, the civil strives, civil wars, nationally or intra, have been reduced a lot by a lot of international mechanisms like this peacekeeping, like what's the role of United Nations, the subgroups, the continental groups, and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So perhaps you can take those first two questions and then we'll go back again to the audience.
They're nice complementary questions in a way, because you're quite right. I don't know where my question went. There you are. Thank you. The situation in the Cold War was radically different to the situation at the international level now. There's plenty of historical evidence to show that both sides in the Cold War were quite happy to work with criminal groups if that expanded their power, if it the Cold War actors' power, if it helped them achieve their strategic goals. There's long established evidence, for example, of the relationship between the CIA and drug traffickers in Southeast Asia. So I think what shifted after the end of the Cold War was both that this wasn't seen as necessary and the rise of liberal norms around notions of democracy and criminal justice, the promotion of criminal justice at the international level, and so forth. So it's proven perhaps something of a strategic surprise to us that when we go into a country and mess around with its political structures, it turns out that we leave gaps behind that strong men can exploit in ways that we weren't expecting. And many of these problems have proven more stubborn, even wicked, than we were anticipating. We don't necessarily have the institutional capacities in place to be able to read them, let alone respond to them. As I said, a lot of the information about these groups is available to government, but it's dispersed across a wide number of agencies. Intelligence agencies surely have a lot of information about what some of these groups are up to, but they're probably that information is probably rather disconnected from what's going on in development agencies. And it may be that some of the information available to diplomats and military actors is not being examined through the kinds of analytical lenses that we've been talking about here today, and not being examined for impact on long-term development. So we need to think about joining up these, this information into more coherent strategic analysis. That comes back to the question, Ambassador, about how do we approach this at the international level. Again, it's tricky, not only because information is dispersed, but also because there's a fundamental barrier to doing it at the international level, which is this. As soon as you call something crime, it's a matter for national government. There may be a basis for international cooperation, but it's not a matter to be dealt with by the international community. That would breach all sorts of norms around sovereignty and territorial integrity. So by calling the thing crime, we create obstacles to discussing it at the international level. We've moved over the last 20 years on that issue in relation to civil war. We're much more willing to discuss civil war at the international level now than we were during the Cold War. But on crime, we're not there yet. And that is because criminal justice, defining what is criminal and enforcing those norms, is so central to the idea of the monopoly on legitimate violence that it is at the heart of sovereignty. For a sovereign to say, my use of force is just enforcement of the law, your use of force, that's criminal, that's going to be punished by my use of force, that goes to the heart of sovereignty. So it's very difficult for states to agree to cede that power, to define a group as a criminal group, and for enforcement action to be set in train. To release those powers to the international community is very difficult. And although we do see movement in the United Nations and other forums on these issues, it is probably politely described as glacial.
Jennifer.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to James for a fascinating presentation. Jennifer Salahub with the North-South Institute Development Think Tank here in town. I have 3 questions and I came up with 2, or I came up to the mic with only 2, so your comments have provoked a third one. They're not really related, so maybe I'll just go through them and try to be quick about it. My first question is about if you could, you started to touch on some of these issues in your presentation. I'm wondering if you could give a bit more insight into what you think your take on this whole situation means for sort of traditional security sector reform and DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. If these are sort of not traditional actors, what does that mean for how we do those sorts of things if we're wanting to move towards treating them more like we've been treating rebel groups, militarized rebel groups, armed non-state actors. The second question is, who is best placed? Which actors are best placed to engage organized criminals, or whatever new term we need to come up with for them if we want to get away from calling them criminals? It seems to me that, particularly given the comments you just made about sovereignty, that the inherent but fuzzy challenge to the state's power makes the state sort of a difficult actor to engage directly. So who would be best placed? And then my third question is sort of taking all of this into consideration, your comments on sovereignty, on how these are sort of national issues, and yet there's transnational elements. Is there anything that, and who would do it to prevent more of this kind of activity? I'm not thinking sort of, perhaps, yeah, I'll just leave it there because it's a fuzzy question for me. Thanks.
Excellent questions again. I'll go through them. I think they are connected, actually, in a way. What's the impact on DDR and SSR activities? Well, let's just kind of think it through how you'd actually do DDR with these guys. The first thing you need to be able to do is talk to them. It's not clear to me that is lawful for many organizations right now. If you're an American NGO and you have lunch with somebody from the Taliban, say to talk to them about a DDR program, and you pay for their lunch, you have risked prosecution under the material support law. There's a new law just gone through Congress, does the same thing for the M23 rebel group in eastern DRC. We're seeing this law, this norm proliferating in US law and being picked up by some donor agencies elsewhere, requiring different kinds of reporting by development actors to make sure that money doesn't move from the development donor through their hands into the hands of a group that is considered essentially an outlaw. So there's a problem right there for doing DDR. Let's say you don't have that problem. Then you need to think about how you structure your program so that it's sufficiently attractive for people to want to demobilize. You need to figure out what their price is. And here it's very challenging because it's hard to get good numbers on what money they're making from criminal markets. And it also depends radically on what's going on in the criminal market elsewhere. If you're talking about a drug market, that's a global market, and we have very bad data on it. So it's very hard to predict market dynamics. That makes it hard to accurately identify an asking price for DDR. It also may vary hugely depending on where you are in the criminal organization as to what your asking price is. Still, that may be the same with traditional DDR. So there are factors like that, essentially, that go to criminal market analysis that we need to incorporate into DDR. And then we have to think about how we actually implement the program once we've designed it. And that comes on to your second question of who should be doing the engagement. If it's a state-run program, or if it's state engagement to build peace, you precisely have the problem that you pointed to, that the state is, okay, organized crime needs the state, but the state is kind of the enemy. I mean, the corruption is designed to nobble the state's enforcement power because the enforcement power is a risk for the criminal organization. So having the state as the overseer of such programming may skew the incentive structure for the people you're trying to reach. So you need neutral third parties. Where do you find them? Well, in El Salvador right now, there's an interesting process going on with the two main Maras negotiating a truce. And there's a kind of interesting mix of different third parties have become involved. Yes, the state has been involved, but it's also relied on elements of the Catholic Church, and more recently it's looked to the Organization of American States to lend some kind of credibility and certainty to the process for the parties engaged in it. And that brings me back, I think, to the third question, what's going on internationally, particularly on the prevention side, if I've understood. Well, it's very diffuse and fragmented right now. But I think in particular, you're seeing a convergence of practice amongst people involved in what in the development world is known as armed violence reduction, with some security practitioners and some of the people who've had strategic experiences in places like Afghanistan, realizing that it's one thing to transfer power at the political level, but if you're actually going to transform power at the local level, you need a whole different set of tools. These communities are only just really beginning to talk to each other. Sometimes they're doing it in very subject matter specific contexts, like cocaine trafficking in West Africa, or the global drug system and whether there should be liberalization of drug control policies. Sometimes they're doing it at rather more abstract level around armed violence reduction, for example. What I think we need to see is a thickening of those networks so that all of these experts can begin to understand where they have approaches in common, where they differ, and how they can actually build operationalizable, to coin a term, implementation frameworks that you could actually test in real life in some of these places.
Okay, great. So we have approximately 10 minutes left, so we'll close with the two individuals that are standing now. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Sam Hansen. I'm a retired diplomat with experience in the former Yugoslavia and the Sudan, where questions of national sovereignty and territorial integrity and their troubling absence were a large part of my daily bread for some time. I wish I could say I felt ever so much better after listening to your presentation, but I suspect you went to some effort to make it less troubling than it really is. I go back to your initial point that what we call criminal organizations are seeking power rather than just profit. But as you went on, it seemed to me that power and profit are not mutually exclusive objectives. In fact, they're mutually reinforcing. And so my question is, does a successful peacemaking strategy have to involve disrupting the connection between power and profit, probably against the heated resistance of those who benefit from it? And how on earth would we begin to go about it? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to echo people's congratulations and thanks for a very, very well presented presentation. My question is...
Your name first, please. Your name?
I'm sorry. My name is Sheila Katz. I worked in development issues in Latin America for many decades. My question is, how do you think the recent impunity allowed to HSBC executives for their money laundering convictions or their crimes involving money laundering for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, how is that going to affect the work that these state institutions are trying to carry out to control or find solutions to this international organized crime? And maybe we could end this session by a lighter question. Do you watch Breaking Bad?
Breaking Bad. I'm more of a Wire fan, actually.
Pardon?
I'm more of a Wire fan, I must admit. Lots of really good questions there. Let me start with the HSBC impunity one. And I'll just check, we're on the record here, right?
Yes,
Yes.
we have CPAC here as well.
And I'll put my lawyer's hat on this, not to plead the fifth or anything, but actually to say that I think the fundamental problem with that approach, as helpful as it may be to national fiscal position, is that it suggests inequality before the law. That if you're a Somali pirate seized by the American Navy, you end up doing life in prison, whereas if you're HSBC, you don't. I understand the complexities of decision-making that go into reaching that kind of settlement. I understand the importance of an institution like HSBC to, as my American friends like to say, moms and pops who have mortgages. But I also understand that HSBC is a big organisation, and it's surprising that there's not one individual there who the prosecutors felt was sufficiently culpable to even take a prosecution to a grand jury. So there are questions about inequality before the law that are raised by that, and that do make it difficult to send strong and clear signals to other financial institutions that may be wittingly or otherwise assisting this kind of activity, that it will not be tolerated. And if we don't send those kinds of signals, what we're doing is allowing the entire global economy to be penetrated by this power, because we should not assume that local strongmen in these hinterlands are not availing themselves of the technologies of the modern international financial system. On the contrary, you know, John Kerry, the incoming Secretary of State, went on the record about 20 years ago saying that offshore banking centres exist only to pirate money from other economies. They are essentially looting money from other economies. And we should assume that the kinds of actors we've been talking about today are availing themselves of those technologies. So if we want to transform that kind of system, we need to be sending credible deterrent threats, and I'm not sure we're doing that right now. Ambassador Hansen, your excellent question about the link between power and profit and how we can break that link without causing a lot of trouble is, I think, the heart of the matter. The reality is that we do know that there is a way to reduce violence involved in organised crime, and that is to allow people who've developed power through organised crime either to continue to operate if they won't engage in violence, or to roll the power that they've got through criminal activity into the legitimate political or economic structure. That reduces violence. So the challenge that confronts us, the dilemma that confronts us is, what do we want? Do we want to reduce violence now, or do we want to punish those who've engaged in criminal activity? There are very good reasons to choose both of those answers. It's very difficult at a national level, though, to have a conversation, a sensible conversation about this, while we continue to hide behind labels, which I am as guilty of as anyone, such as organised crime, because of the baggage that comes with it. We have to unpack the activities and power bases of these organisations and unpack what they actually offer people, for good or for ill. It is also even more difficult to have that discussion at the international level for all of the reasons of national sovereignty that you referred to.
Well, on that note of a policy dilemma that all of us face and will no doubt continue to try to tackle, including IDRC and the research that we support, I'd like to thank you, James, for a very thought-provoking and important message. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming, and for CPAC as well for being here. And stay tuned to the next series of talks as well. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.